It's been a few months now since we've had a guardian come in to educate us more on our branch, and we're super stoked to have tonight's guest joining us to speak about the Space Force, how it plays a part in our day-to-day lives, and why we need to understand and support its mission and be an advocate for the service. How often do we need space capabilities, cell phones, ATMs, GPS, the internet, to name a few? But what would happen if our systems were compromised? I'll let tonight's guest, Senior Executive Officer to the Chief of Space Operations, Colonel Casey Beard, answer those questions and tell us more. Colonel Beard, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
I will move on without further ado getting into the charts. I'll say that the title of this presentation is a bit of a misnomer. It's what's new in the Space Force. But really what the presentation and the discussion is focused on is why in the world do we even have a Space Force? Why do we exist? And certainly I can touch on a few things that are going on. Again, kind of hit on the focus of this afternoon or this evening. We'll cover the space domain. What in the world is space? What do we consider space? And the importance that it is to our or gives to our national prosperity and defense. Again, hit a lot on why we exist. Maybe touch on some recent highlights. All right, the space domain itself. Let's start here. Start pretty basic. Where does space start? Where does it end? Depending on where you look, you could look at NASA, at the DoD, Department of Commerce, several other places. You might find different definitions of where space starts. But the Department of Defense specifically labels 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface as the beginning of space, and it goes out to infinity, to infinity and beyond, I guess. So the reason why 100 kilometers was chosen, more or less, is that effectively that's the altitude at which Bernoulli's principle, that is the laws that govern and the physics that govern flight, give way to Kepler. And Kepler is the laws of Kepler and the Keplerian laws that start to dictate space flight. And we'll get into a little bit of what that means and the differences associated with that. So that's essentially why we chose 100 kilometers above Earth's surface. Next thing you can see there is space is pretty big. 73 trillion cubic miles, and that's just the volume of space between the Earth and the Moon. That's not the solar system, that's not Earth to Mars, etc., Earth Sun. That's just Earth to Moon. So there's a lot of space to cover, which means you're going to be going fast, and you're going to be in a wide range of temperatures. So for those of you that may have seen Apollo 13 years ago, this is probably no surprise, but whether you're in the shade or during direct sunlight, those spacecraft that are in the domain are subject to extreme temperatures down to negative 200 all the way up to positive 200 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes greater. So again, very extreme temperatures. Our spacecraft have to be hardened and designed to be able to withstand the expansion and contraction associated with those temperatures. Velocities, like I said, are extreme. In low Earth orbit, which we'll talk about in a minute, 17,500 miles per hour. So you're hauling, you're moving pretty quick. And then lastly here, and if you can see me, I don't know if you can actually see me. Okay, that's good, because I'm going to give you some hand signals. I like to talk with my hands every now and then. Spacecraft don't fly. They're actually continuously falling around the Earth. If you think of centripetal force, and I'll give you an example, a little bit of that in a minute. Spacecraft are moving at 17,500 miles an hour. They're going so fast, and the Earth's gravitational pull continues to try to pull it back toward Earth, but the Earth's curvature prevents the spacecraft from actually falling back toward the Earth, as does its velocities. So essentially what's happening are the spacecraft are continuously falling around the Earth as they try to escape with their speed, but the Earth's gravitational field continues to pull them in. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of inside baseball into some orbital mechanics based off of that. You're going to be foundational orbital warfare experts on how we do some of this. So visualize for you, because I'm not going to do this in our kitchen, because I'm going to end up break something or hitting somebody. But if you visualize a ball on a string, and with your hand in the middle, and your hand or your fist is the Earth, and you're rotating that ball on the string at a certain speed. When you pull or shorten the length of that string, what tends to happen? That ball will start to spin a lot faster as it gets closest to your hand. And as you lengthen the string, the ball's speed, relative speed around your hand, will slow down. So I'm sure you can visualize what I'm talking about. So That basic premise applies directly to orbit, spacecraft in orbit. So if I was attempting to run you down, if I was a spacecraft trying to engage another spacecraft, and I was trying to close the gap between two spacecraft. On Earth, what you'd expect to do, this is back to Bernoulli's principle, you'd expect to accelerate, to speed up, to catch that person in front of you. Well, in space, it's the complete opposite. If I'm looking to speed up, actually what I want to do is lower my distance from Earth or lower my altitude. Think of the ball spinning and shortening the cord that's holding it up to the Earth. Once that altitude drops, that spacecraft is going to go a lot faster around the Earth relative to the other spacecraft. So if I want to speed up, I'm actually slowing down. I have to deboost, lower my altitude, and I'm speeding up now, dropping below and catching up to that spacecraft in front of me. Conversely, if I want a spacecraft to zoom past and I want to drift behind it, what I really want to do is boost. I want to increase my velocity, kick it up the spacecraft to a spacecraft to a higher altitude, and then the spacecraft below me will zoom past and I'll drift behind it. We can talk more about that if that was confusing, but the bottom line premise of orbital mechanics is you speed up to slow down and you slow down to speed up. So if I haven't lost you then, maybe I'll have an opportunity in the next couple of slides. And again, stop me at any time if you have any questions at all. All right, so moving in the next slide here in the space domain, there are three basic types of orbits that we deal with. You'll hear other types, but these are the fundamental ones, foundational orbits that we all refer to. We like to use acronyms, of course, but those are LEO, low Earth orbit, MEO, medium Earth orbit, and GEO, geosynchronous Earth orbit. A couple things about those. LEO orbits have altitudes up to about 1,200 miles above the Earth's surface. They take about 90 minutes for one complete rotation or orbit around the Earth. We call an orbit a singular orbit, the period. So it's about a 90-minute period around the Earth. Think of the International Space Station, some of our critical intelligence capabilities, and the Starlink system all reside in low Earth orbit. So yes, ISS, our astronauts in the ISS are going about 17,000 miles an hour. They orbit the Earth once every about 90 minutes. And it's approximately 7 to 10 minutes from horizon to horizon. If you look up at the sky, it would take about 7 to 10 minutes for that spacecraft in low Earth orbit to cover the horizon. Medium Earth orbit, MEO, you'll hear that term, are satellites that go with altitudes up to about 12,000 miles. Again, back to this basic idea of the ball on a string. You're at a higher altitude, they're going slower, so they're going to be, their orbital period or one complete orbit is going to take longer. So these take about 12 hours to orbit the Earth. The classic system that we have residing in MEO is the GPS, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Lastly, is geosynchronous Earth orbit, or GEO. These are satellites with altitudes up to about 24,000 miles. And there's something very special about this altitude, and it was actually discovered in the 40s and 50s. Arthur C. Clarke discovered that there's this point in space, an altitude in space, where the orbital period or the rotation of a spacecraft in that orbit happens to match the rotation of the Earth. So it's about a 24-hour period, or 24 hours for one complete orbit around the Earth. Spacecraft like DirecTV, for example, reside in that orbit. That's why your DirecTV or dish antennas you can place on your roof, and you don't have to move them because that antenna is constantly pointing at that DirecTV satellite, and it's rotating at the same speed, the same rate, and it makes it easy. Other significant or key missions we have in GEO are missile warning satellites, such as the Space-Based Infrared System, which I'll discuss in a minute. For the sake of time, I do want to draw your attention. There's a few did you knows in the bottom left-hand corners of the screen. I'm not going to hit every one of them again because I want to get to a few more topics. There's a few that I'll pop up and discuss here in a moment. So that's what that did you know is about. We'll skip this one for now.
They've asked if they can get a copy of these slides, if that's possible.
Absolutely. We'll send those to Amy and the team. All right, so why does the Space Force exist? It really comes down to a couple things. One, reliance on space, and two, the threat associated with it. So we'll start with the reliance on space, particularly for national defense. So this is where I'm going to get into a little bit of history. Hopefully, eyes don't glaze over too much, but it's important to why we have a Space Force today. I'll say this, over the last 30 years, Our space-based capabilities are fundamental. They're essential to our ability to project and employ power around the globe. If we go back all the way to 1991, two critical things happened that inform and influence how we operate and think about space today. The first was Desert Storm. That war really defined and set expectations for how we think war and visualize war happening really since then. We had precision guided munitions. We could strike with precision in math. We could use global satellite communications to command and control our forces at scale in a way that we had never done before. Most of our satellites, most of our space-based capabilities up to that point were designed for the Cold War, were designed for nuclear deterrence, nuclear command and control. And it was really the first time that we had experienced the benefits of space-based capabilities to support conventional warfare. So that was a very critical learning experience for Desert Storm. In fact, we were so effective, surprisingly effective at Desert Storm, that the Joint Force, it created an insatiable appetite from the Joint Force for more space, more satellite communications, more surveillance and reconnaissance for intelligence, more missile warning, more position navigation and timing capabilities. So an insatiable appetite. Well, a second event occurred on and around 1991 into 1992, and that was the end of the Cold War. And what that essentially meant was that the Soviet Union no longer existed, and the United States had no peer competitor left in space. So while we were investing heavily in more and more space-based capabilities to support the rest of the Joint Force, we didn't have to worry about a threat. So we didn't have to think about fighting or contesting the domain to ensure that access, because it was essentially a given. We could operate with impunity in the domain, and that will come in as a critical factor here later momentarily. So as a result of all of that, effectiveness in Desert Storm and the end of the Cold War, we ended up significantly scaling down the Joint Force. The Joint Force could be much more expeditionary. It could be smaller. We could affect more, create more damage, more effects. With a smaller force, we could be more precise. So we didn't have to worry about collateral damage. We didn't have to worry about indiscriminate destruction. We could be very precise, surgical in how we did business. So we didn't need as big of a force to maintain that type of a capability. I've also alluded to this, and this is important for us to be aware of. Our space-based capabilities, because of the effectiveness they give to the rest of the Joint Force, they actually affect public perceptions about how war is waged. We expect low collateral damage. We expect little to no casualties, understandably and rightfully so, but we've become accustomed to that. And we could easily lose sight of the way war has been conducted and waged over the centuries leading up to this. So not only is it essential to power projection and employment, but it also affects and allows for, for a lack of a better term, a cleaner approach, a more surgical approach to warfare than at any point in time in history prior to that. And as Amy mentioned, space also is critical to our national prosperity. Our reliance on space for communications, again, position, navigation, and timing, natural disasters, weather, agriculture, science, technology, it's so embedded and so integrated into our way of life. You can't detangle it. We've grown so accustomed to that. Our simple transactions at an ATM, on Wall Street, power grids, gas stations, satellite communications, all of those basic functions that we take for granted, for example, rely on the timing signal provided by the GPS constellation. If we didn't have that, it would actually fundamentally significantly degrade our finances, our banking, our power, and our livelihoods, and the way we expect to live. Agriculture is also very significant. Interestingly enough, John Deere at one point had looked into even investing in its own satellite constellation for communications, for natural weather phenomenology and whatnot. We might have a question.
Can you tell everyone what Joint
Force
means?
Sure. So the Joint Force simply is the grouping or the collective term that we use for all of the military services. So the Space Force, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and as appropriate, the Coast Guard, all comprise collectively the Joint Force. So when I say the Joint Force, it is the entirety of the military services. So hopefully that answers the question. So our reliance on space for national defense, essential national prosperity, our everyday way of life is predicated on the constant, persistent availability of space-based capability. All right, a few examples of what we have in the domain, and I'll move a little bit quicker here. I've already mentioned GPS. Its main mission is positioning, navigation, and timing. Its orbit is MEO, medium Earth orbit. Its fleet, we have a minimum of 24 spacecraft. We actually have more GPS satellites in orbit than 24, but you need a minimum of 24 spacecraft to give the signal, the precision that we've come accustomed to every day. And those 24 spacecraft are divided into 6 orbital planes. So 4 GPS satellites in each of the 6 planes in a very deliberate fashion. You need a minimum of 4 GPS satellites with the right spacing and the right sequencing to be able to give you the signal that's needed, the timing signal that's needed to know where you are anywhere on the map. It was made publicly available in 1993. And a quick did you know, the actual concept of GPS came about in 1973 in what was called the Lonely Halls discussion over Labor Day weekend, with a few smart guys went to a chalkboard, probably not a whiteboard, and came up with the concept. 20 years later, made publicly available, and now fully embedded into the global economy. Another
question based on 2 previous slides where
Sure.
you're talking about the reliance on space, things like that. The recent solar activity, how would that have impacted some of these things?
Yeah, no, great question. So yes, there is always potential for solar activity to cause disruption to our circuitry on orbit with our spacecraft, to our ability through the radio frequency spectrum, the frequencies that we use to connect to the spacecraft on orbit can sometimes be jammed or affected by solar activity, various radiation. The spacecraft are intentionally designed to be able to withstand a certain amount of that, to conduct their own anomaly resolution and to work through that. But there are occasions where we could lose connectivity, lose contact, and essentially lose the capability or have it at least degraded because of solar activity. And that is something that we expect and work through and have contingencies to be able to handle. Great question, though. Okay, and then lastly, and this one's a little bit more near and dear to my heart. Oh, and what I didn't mention, I'm sorry, thinking about this. So I'm going to go back to GPS and the other 2 systems. GPS is operated by the 2nd Space Operations Squadron, TUSOPS, at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado, and TUSOPS falls under Delta 8. So Delta 8 is our GPS. Well, I stand corrected. We actually have, and I can talk about this in a minute, we actually have a new provisional command, an integrated mission delta, which is essentially a test delta that we're looking to improve and enhance the way we do unified command of operations and sustainment of those systems. So actually, relatively hot off the press, it's been several months now, and I can talk about this more. The GPS system is one of the first that now falls under a provisional command that is our NAVOR integrated mission delta. The SBIRS system, which is the next example I have in GEO, missile warning system, the space-based infrared system. This provides infrared capabilities to detect missile launches. So whether it's in a strategic missile launch for nuclear missiles themselves that threaten the United States, all the way to tactical missiles that could have been launched in Ukraine, perhaps against Israel, and recently from Iran, and around the globe. These systems are designed to be able to detect those and provide adequate warning to our forces. And SBIRS is a critical component of that. They reside in GEO. There's about 6 of those, and they are operated by the 2nd Space Warning Squadron up at Buckley Space Force Base as part of Delta 4. Lastly, this one's kind of near and dear to my heart, as I mentioned. The Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program, GSAP. It's kind of a mouthful. We don't talk about this one a lot. It is unclassified, of course, but there's a lot of other speculation about what it is. GSAP is operated by the 1st Space Operations Squadron at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado and falls under Delta 9. Both of those are my former units that I commanded there. So pretty neat mission, conducting surveillance and reconnaissance in GEO. 6 highly maneuverable spacecraft. So these are smaller spacecraft designed to maneuver to be able to collect on other spacecraft using optical capabilities, so imagery, to characterize those spacecraft. Sometimes they're referred to as neighborhood watch, to ensure that everything that is up on orbit is as it should be and is not threatening. So it can provide attribution, if you will, maybe identify threats or areas of concern, and also support anomaly resolution. If we have issues with our spacecraft on orbit, our own spacecraft, GSAT can be used to take images and support anomaly resolution there. Okay, so that's the first big part of that. The next piece that I'd like to hit on, and again, we don't talk a lot about the threat in open forums, but there's a lot more that you can discuss on classified than you may realize. So the first part of the reason why we exist is to provide those critical capabilities to the Joint Force and to the nation, and really to the world, that we've come to rely on. The second big piece to the reason why we exist, and the emergent reason why the Space Force exists, is because of the threat. And Amy and for the team there, I did provide an unclassified handout, a threat fact sheet that was developed by our S2, which is our code for our intelligence team at Headquarters Space Force, unclassified, available to you all to review and read at your leisure. I'm going to hit some highlights from that. And in fact, the threat is changing so fast, so rapidly, that some of the material I have on this chart is already outdated after only a month or two. So the big takeaway on the threat: there's two key factors to be aware of when it comes to the threat in space. One, adversaries recognize our reliance on space. The Chinese in particular watched our success on the battlefield of Desert Storm and fundamentally, completely changed their approach to warfare, and realized that they had to take a very drastic, some drastic measures to adjust their forces to be able to compete and gain an advantage against the United States. So their intent, and open press and academics and writing and whatnot, is explicitly stated to deny the U.S. our use of space in crisis and conflict. PRC and the Russians primarily are the adversaries referenced here. They've developed direct ascent anti-satellite missiles, so DAASATs. These are ground-based missiles that are designed to launch rapidly and kinetically destroy satellites on orbit. The Chinese, Russians have also developed co-orbital ASATs, so spacecraft designed to disrupt, degrade, deny other spacecraft on orbit. And they've also developed directed energy, which is just another way to say laser, and electronic warfare. That's jamming. Those are largely ground-based capabilities with antennas that are designed to jam signals up on orbit. And I'll talk a little bit about our systems as well in that regard. But that's only half the battle with the threat. The second half, and the one that is emerging probably the most quickly and most concerning, is that, as you'd expect, the Chinese have watched our ability and our effectiveness on the battlefield, and they are copying us. They are mirroring that. And they have now developed a very sophisticated, very capable space-based kill web that is designed to find, target, and strike U.S. forces. Our Navy forces, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Pacific Ocean, our air forces, should we have to come to the aid of Taiwan, for example. That's a long range. The Pacific Ocean is a big ocean, and it requires over-the-horizon communications. It requires intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, and precision because of the distance. And the Chinese are looking to, and have fielded, again, sophisticated capabilities designed to target and strike our long-range forces. For example, just this year, they have, in 2023, I should say, China had over 66 space launches with 217 payloads launched. And this number, again, is one of those that are outdated. They have now placed over 800 spacecraft in orbit, and that's actually a growth of over 550% since 2015. So they are exponentially growing the size of their space, of their fleet. 470 of those, at least, are surveillance and reconnaissance spacecraft, again, specifically designed to find, target, and strike the joint force. Russia, much smaller, 19 launches in 2023. They have the third largest space program, but there's two things I want to highlight here just to keep in the back of your mind. We all know about GPS, but the Chinese and the Russians have both developed their own organic GPS-like systems. The Chinese have developed Beidou, and the Russians have developed and employ their system known as GLONASS. Of interest there, should the Chinese or the Russians decide to deny our access to GPS, they could still technically operate with precision navigation and timing using their own BeiDou and GLONASS capabilities, respectively. So there's concern there about their ability to operate and denying ours. A couple more charts, and I think we'll look to kind of wrap up here. I've talked about some of the examples of the threat. There's two I want to highlight for you, just for your awareness. That's the Chinese low Earth orbit test in 2007. So in 2007, just 16 years after Desert Storm, the Chinese ended up doing their first direct descent test and destroyed one of their defunct weather satellites in low Earth orbit. That destruction occurred at a much higher altitude than we believe is appropriate, and that test generated over 3,000 pieces of debris. And I'll get to that here in a second as well. The Russians in 2021, so this is in November of 21, just 2-3 months prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also conducted a low Earth orbit direct descent test, created over 1,500 pieces of debris, and really that was a show of force prior to their invasion of Ukraine. What's critical there, and what's unique about space, is that if you were to shoot an aircraft down, that aircraft leaves the domain. And unfortunately, it would crash and go to the ground, and as some would say, that becomes the Army's problem to clean up, but it's no longer in the domain itself. If you were to sink a ship, that ship sinks to the bottom of the ocean, is now outside of the lane, the sea lane of communication. However, if you destroy a spacecraft on orbit, that debris propagates on orbit and can take years, decades, or even centuries, depending on its altitude, before it actually comes back in. So not only do you destroy a satellite, you create dangerous conditions for the remaining spacecraft on orbit, and it's agnostic to who that belongs to, whether it's civil, military, or commercial spacecraft. So that's a critical concern. The last thing I want to highlight is China's SJ-21. This is a system that is a grappler, and we detected this in January of 2022. The system is in GEO. The SJ-21 moved in close proximity to one of China's defunct BeiDou satellites, one of their positioning, navigation, and timing systems. It grappled that satellite, pulled it up about 300 kilometers of a higher altitude into a junkyard orbit, jettisoned it, and immediately maneuvered back down to GEO and continued to patrol GEO. And it did that in a matter of a week or less. Incredible technology, and that gives you an example of the type of core orbital ASAT or threat that our spacecraft on orbit could face at any given time. So combining all that together and kind of wrapping this part of it up, the Space Force exists fundamentally to secure our nation's interests in, from, and to space. We exist to preserve and protect our critical space capabilities from attack, and we exist to deny adversaries' use of space to target, strike, and destroy our joint force. And that's our reason for being, if you will, and why the Space Force exists.